Hi, guys. Welcome to the Gentleman's Jury. I'm your host, Robbie. Today, there won't be a co host or any guests. I'm just speaking to you about a subject that I feel is being degraded, just let down. People aren't really focusing on it, and it's hurting us as a society. And that, of course, is historical truths that are being altered. Like, for instance, one of the things I heard and has just blown my mind that people are willing to accept is the 1619 Project. If you haven't heard of the 1619 Project, it essentially states that American history began in 1619 with the founding of the Jamestown colony. What actually happened was Britain founded that colony, then collapsed and was rebuilt, and more colonies started popping up. And then we get to the 13 colonies, and eventually in 1776, American history starts with the American Revolution, and that's the big takeaway. Like, why would we Why would we add Britain's history in Jamestown, especially because it's pushing a political agenda, because what they're really wanting you to care about is the fact that the first slave came to Jamestown in 1619 and that slavery lasted 250 years. Now, that might be true when you look at the span of all the colonies and Spain and Britain and France bringing in slaves and slaves not having rights. But that isn't the start of American history. And the reason that the distinction is so important is because when you look at what our founding fathers were intending versus what was realistically possible at the time, based on economic and political issues that the 13 colonies were debating over, it it just blows my mind that people will take that and go, well, that's fact now. Like, you have to separate the distinction there, because without the distinction, we can just go, oh, well, in that case, blacks held whites as slaves in Egypt when the Egyptian Empire was around, or when Egypt, enslaved their own people. What about reparations for those people? I mean, like, you start to kind of like just blur the lines between civilizations and what these things mean, and the evolution of man and how we've grown. And the fact that it's for political reasons upsets me more than anything, because that, instead of, like, to break it down a little bit easier, when you think of history, everyone thinks of, oh, it's just the past. Well, you're wrong. History isn't the past. History is the story we tell ourselves of the past, which can be altered, and why we say history. Like the famous saying, history is always written by the victor, which many historians hate because that's not always true. There's survivor stories and things like that. Like, for instance, we know tons about Nazi Germany, despite the fact that Nazi Germany lost. But when you take that story and you say, let's manipulate this like everyone else in history has manipulated it, we can never grow from it. We can never grow from it properly. When we look back at ancient societies that we've modeled America after, Greece and Rome. First, Greece. Greece was on the verge of becoming a maritime empire. I mean, Athens had already done that during the Peloponnesian War, which sparked a war with Sparta, and then eventually led into the Persian War. But then they started allowing things like social issues to weaken them at their core, like transgender issues in ancient Greece. Many of you probably haven't even heard of that. It really happened. I'm not saying trans issues isn't an issue, it's just something to think about. Their democracy fell, and that was a part of it. Socially, they started becoming weak-minded. They started thinking about things that they started exploding these problems that weren't really problems they should have been focusing on. Social problems are obviously problems that many Americans face. Not many of you know, but I have a half black sister, and growing up, I did notice there was prejudice against her. Some of that was self inflicted prejudice because of the way she acted and her attitude, but some of that was also just old fashioned racism. You can't. And racism is another issue we'll get to here a little bit later, but when we talk about um sorry, I lost track of my thoughts. When we're talking about Greece, right? They allowed social issues to dominate their policies and their agenda, and that eventually helped lead to their collapse. Now we go to Rome. And the reason I want to talk about Rome specifically is because there's two major events in Rome that are extremely important, and they kind of mirror our situation. So in Rome, around when Julius Caesar was alive, the Roman Republic was failing. It was failing because there was factions, they were infighting. You had at the time before they got renamed, which we'll get to that as we kind of continue down this little lesson. You had the conservatives and the reformers, and the conservatives, headed by Cato, didn't want to reform Rome, despite the fact that Rome's policies were failing, and it was causing the empire to essentially it was causing the empire more strife internally while they were dealing with external problems. And then you had the reformers who were looking to heavily reform Rome in order to bring it back to its glory. And when we talk about this situation, it eventually led to a civil war. There were a lot of other factors. There was the triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey and Crassus until Crassus died in Syria, and it became Pompey and Caesar's show. And Caesar, having reformed Rome and being a big part of the reason why Rome was doing as well as it did through several policies actually, but some of the big ones was the land distribute. I can't think of the exact name right now, but essentially, wealthy landowners could sell parts of their land to smaller landowners, and it provided more food and generally just helped the economy. Then he did the Bread Act, or the Grain Act, which allowed more people to get subsidized grain. And there were qualifying factors that went into that. It was essentially like if you've ever been on WIC or food stamps, it was kind of like that. And so he helped reform Rome, and Pompey was backing him, and then eventually they had issues that led to a civil war. And part of that was because of factional loyalty, kind of like what we're seeing today in America. I mean, when you think about this last election, and I thought about it a lot. I mean, there's obviously issues that we brought up in the last video about, say, the voter fraud and how many people don't think Joe Biden won the election, especially when given the numbers and all this other stuff, which we all have to put past us because it's January 26th when I'm recording this. Like, it's over. He won. Anyway, many people felt more loyalty to their party than to their country, if that makes sense. Like, a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats both, ended up taking violent action. Democrats did it first in Minnesota with the killing of George Floyd, which was, there's multiple ways to look at it, but it was a tragic act. But did it really require escalation to that force? And then because of that, it sparked this whole movement, which I was kind of trying to build up to. With if you never noticed, you walk into a bookstore. I walk into Barnes and Noble all the time to pick out a book, and So there's a lot more political books about being anti-racist and race agenda and things like that. Well, that also led to the popularization of an article written by a failed Pulitzer Prize. Like, you won a Pulitzer Prize for not being good at history. Like, that should tell you kind of where you stand, like, as a historian. If you win a prize for being terrible at history, you shouldn't be praised as a great historian. But if you know, in Portland, they sprayed 1619 on the statue they tore down of George Washington, which we'll get to here in a bit, too, about monuments historically, whether they're good or bad, and why they shouldn't be deformed or torn down. But how do I to get back on track of where I was going? I got on a tangent there. I apologize, but eventually the reformer faction reformed in the Caesarian faction, and the conservative faction reformed in the Pompeian faction, and Rome split. Civil War. It was brutal. It was a complete waste of life for Romans. I mean, and America's had a civil war, and many of us probably, would think, wow, that was a waste of American lives over an issue that should have been solved earlier. But I kind of digress a little bit. What followed was Caesar gained power. He became dictator for life, was assassinated. Then, during the ensuing power gap, Augustus seized power. And many of you might not know, Augustus would eventually become what I consider the first emperor of Rome, just because of how long he maintained dictatorship. And that kind of ended the Roman Senate era, and the democracy kind of started to flatline a little bit as we started getting more and more Roman emperors. And do you really want that for America? Do you really want one person in charge like they had in Russia? One thing I notice people constantly screaming for is socialism. And socialism tends to lead to communism. I mean, when Lenin took power in the early 1900s, a lot of people died. A lot of people starved to death. And when he died, it led to one of the worst dictators the world has ever known, and that being Stalin. And America could easily fall into that rut, giving all the infighting. I mean, I'm no expert in politics. I'm no expert in history. I'm currently studying it to be a teacher, but I'm noticing the similarities, and I'm noticing a lot of similarities, and I think a lot of people need to be informed about that. One of the things I feel a lot of people don't think about too is when the Civil War happened, it was also a splitting of North and South. More people cared more for their state than their country, and obviously slavery was a big issue. But again, people split into factions, and the country tore itself apart. Thankfully, Abraham Lincoln, one of our greatest presidents, was able to kind of mend us back together. But it still happened, and we're on the verge of it. I mean, look around. You can't have a normal conversation anymore. Most people can't have a normal conversation anymore because you're worried of offending someone. Well, that was the other thing. Rome, when it finally fell, was also dealing with, you guessed it, social issues, transgender issues. They were also dealing with persecution of Romans, although that kind of started to digress earlier, but they were still dealing with those issues. And instead of dealing with the outside issues that mattered, like the fact that all their neighbors wanted Rome to fall, instead they focused on issues internally that didn't matter. They should have spend time bolstering their economy, recovering from economic, trying to stabilize and prevent economic collapse, preparing legions for the inevitable fight with your neighbors. I mean, there are other things to focus on, and America's kind of seeing that too. I mean, economically, we're on the uptick, and then Biden comes into office, and boom, 50,000 jobs just gone because they shut down a pipeline. And I know a lot of you are going to say, well, only the pipeline workers lost their job. Well, that's not true, because there were people who supported the pipeline workers, and those lost their job, and the people who supported them lost their job. There's a lot of people that lost their job the second he did that. And also, without us distributing our own oil, gas prices will go up, and our economy is going to take a hit. And I think a lot of you also know that your house payment's coming up. You know, that balloon payment you did because of COVID? Yeah, that's all going to be due right away. And some of you might not be able to pay it. And then we'll have another housing crisis. And we might deal with another depression. It might even be worse than a depression, because at least during the depression, we had World War II to kind of pull us out with that war economy. We don't want another war. Many of us are tired of it. I mean, think about it. We just went through an entire century of back-to-back conflicts. World War I in 1914. I mean, America didn't get in until later in the war, but that's not the point. Then we had World War II. And then Korea. And Vietnam. And then we got involved in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and then Iraq and Iran. And we've just constantly been fighting. Many people are just tired of that. We don't want to go to war with Russia and China. I mean, those are the two biggest people in the world that want to knock us down. And Europe, because we've played such big brother to them, they're not going to be able to support us as much as we support them. I mean, that's just a fact. You look statistically, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, countries bordering Russia, the second they became part of NATO, their defense budget went down because they knew they had America to defend them. We're the beacon of democracy. Whether people like that or not, that's not the point. We are the beacon of democracy right now, and people don't like that, and people want us to step down. Other people want to be top dog in the world. And if we continue to focus on social issues that don't matter, and I don't mean they don't matter like they shouldn't ever be addressed. I mean, think about everything else going on right now and think, is this something I really need to bring to everyone's attention immediately? No. Your answer should be no. We should be focusing on bettering ourselves and getting back into the, to where we used to be. And I don't mean, we need to regress. We need to progress. We need to progress in the right areas. One of the things that I've noticed is education decline. And historically, other countries that fell went through the same thing. Roman Greece, their education systems weren't as they weren't as well developed later on before their collapse. Our economy. We used to have the best economy. And now we're just fighting to have a decent economy. Why? We should absolutely have... if we are the beacon of democracy for the world, and if we are if we are who the world thinks we are, we need to do better. And we need to do this by focusing on problems that matter right now. And stop allowing parties to divide us. Our economy needs to do better. Our education needs to do better. We need to progress scientifically. I get people want to stop the environmental changes. Well, guess who you need to point fingers at first? It ain't us. It ain't the US. China's the biggest polluter on the planet, but everyone wants to go, well, the US needs to cut down. And sure, we do. I absolutely agree. Eventually we need to cut down, but we need to cut down on the people who are actively affecting us the worst right away. And people don't want to do that. And we need to work on the accountability. I mean, people just get away with stuff so easily for no reason. People get to say the dumbest shit, and no one stops them. No one says, "What do you mean?" Like, when did you stop holding the person, your friend, accountable? When did you stop holding your wife accountable? When did your wife stop holding you accountable? When did your husband stop holding you accountable? And I don't know if there's any historical context behind that, but there probably is. At some point, people just stop holding other people accountable. We need to really think and look at historical evidence and historical fact, not historical opinion like the 1619 Project or how America's always been racist or institutionally flawed. It has been institutionally flawed. I'm not going to deny that, but it has not always been racist. We need to look at the things that matter right now and focus on that. We need, and we have tons of historical context to build off of in order to improve. I mean, when we look back, I'm taking an education class right now. When you look back, what qualifies many of these teachers to be teachers? A 4-year degree because they were a student. You know what other what other time period that was? The colonial time period. Yeah, that's right. People were taught in colonial era because other people were students at one point. Which means you're just teaching the same thing over and over and over and over. You're not encouraging progress. You're just pumping numbers, getting kids to pass so they can go out in the world and take their place in life. And other countries do it too. And historically, it eventually catches up with us. And I think that's why there's also a lack of respect for intelligence in this country anymore. I mean, when we look back at this last election, why were Donald Trump and Joe Biden our best candidates? I mean, anyone in their right mind would think, hey, maybe we should go with somebody else. Maybe we should go with someone who's a little bit more qualified. I mean, don't get me wrong, Donald Trump's policies economically helped immensely pull us out of the 8-year wreck that was the Obama administration with their healthcare plan. And that's... I'm trying to stay historical. But let's talk about this free healthcare plan, because I feel a lot of people aren't educated about that either. You know who else has free healthcare right now? Canada. Do you know what Canada has? Waiting lists for things that are important. Cancer treatments, heart transplants. I mean, we have waiting lists for heart transplants too. Surgeries. They get to pick and choose who lives and who dies, because if it's all free, not everyone can be entitled to the same healthcare. And I don't think people understand that. Equality and equity are two different things, and people don't understand that. And that's that's the thing. People aren't understanding what's going on because they don't know historically what it means. So, just food for thought. That's the and this was my first solo episode, so I hope you guys like it, and I'll see you guys next time.